having spoken with a lot of people with a near-death experience, hundreds of thousands, and have received more than 10,000 emails from all over the world, people who share the NDE with me. I was, after years of study and meeting patients with an NDE, I am now convinced that death is not the end. Death is the end of our body, but not the end of our consciousness. So I talk now about the continuity of consciousness. And that's what I learned. And so I always tell people that people with a near-death experience have been my greatest teachers as well.
Dr. Pim van Lommel, welcome to Beyond Meaning. It is an honor and a pleasure to have you on the show. Your work is extremely important, sits on the crossroads of science, philosophy, but also spirituality, and I would say religion as well. You have come up with some very compelling findings in the mysterious field of or area of research of near-death experiences. You have published a pioneering study of near-death experiences among survivors of cardiac arrest. And your study, which is arguably the most important scientific study of this phenomenon, has opened it up for mainstream science. On top of that, you have also proposed a new theory of what consciousness is, how it relates to the brain, and what our essence as conscious beings is, based on your findings. So a lot of really interesting things and questions to discuss with you.
You're welcome.
But for viewers and listeners who are not familiar with your name and even not familiar with near-death experience, could you introduce your life and work, how you came to encounter near-death experiences, and then what was the process that led you to that very important study that you conducted and published?
Okay, so I'm Pim van Lommel. I'm a Dutch cardiologist, and in 1969, when I just started my specialization in cardiology, I was working on one of the first coronary care units in the Netherlands. We sometimes forget that before 1967, all patients died of cardiac arrest because there were no modern resuscitation techniques like defibrillation and electric shock and external chest compression. So one of the first patients we had a cardiac arrest, and we resuscitated him with, I think, 3 or 4 shocks. And after 4 minutes, he regained consciousness, and we were very happy. As a resuscitating team, I was the doctor in charge. But the patient was very, very disappointed. And it told me about light and a tunnel and music and beautiful landscapes, etc. The terminology near-death experience were not yet known at that moment. I was very impressed, but I didn't do anything with it. I was just starting my specialization. I had a family with 2 young children. So only in 1986, I read the book by George Ritchie, Return from Tomorrow, where I described that he died as a medical student in 1943 caused by double pneumonia. There were no antibiotics available for this medical student. So he died, his body was covered with a sheet. And the nurse was so upset that this young medical student had died that she was able to persuade the medical doctor to give him an injection of adrenaline right into his heart. And after 9 minutes of death, he regained consciousness. And he had a little problem to find his body back. But he had a very, very deep near-death experience with all the aspects we know now. I was so impressed by this story that I started to interview my patients who had survived a cardiac arrest if they had memories from the period of unconsciousness. And then within 2 years, out of 50 patients who survived cardiac arrest, 12 patients shared their NDE with me. Now then my scientific curiosity started to grow because we had learned on university and also in schools that consciousness is a product of brain function. So it should be impossible to experience consciousness, let alone enhance consciousness with the possibility of perception, cognition, emotion, memories from early childhood, etc., when the brain does not function at all during cardiac arrest. So, and there had been some theories until that time that lack of oxygen in the brain, hallucinations, effect of neurotransmitters of medication gave rise to these kind of experiences. But had never been a real scientific study performed. That's why we started in 1988 a prospective study in 344 consecutive survivors of cardiac arrest in 10 Dutch hospitals. And all patients had been clinical death. Clinical death is the period of cardiac arrest that people are unconscious because of no circulation, no breathing. And if you don't initiate CPR, cardiopulmonary resuscitation, within 5 to 10 minutes, all patients will die because of irreversible damage to the brain. So it's the first stage of the process of dying. Now, in these patients, we found that 82% did not report any memory of the period of cardiac arrest. However, 18%, 62 patients, reported a near-death experience. And now we wanted to understand what was the reason, what was the explanation that only 80% had these kind of experiences. So we compared the two groups, group with a near-death experience and the group without an NDE, to see if we could find differences. And so we looked for the period of cardiac arrest, if it were 3 minutes or 8 minutes. It didn't matter at all. We looked for a period of unconsciousness, if it were 5 minutes or 3 weeks in coma. It didn't matter at all. If that induced coma in electrophysiological stimulation in the cath lab, usually they are resuscitation within 20 to 30 seconds. It didn't matter at all. So what we found that there is a lack of oxygen in the brain could not be an explanation for having reporting a near-death experience. All patients had been anoxic in the brain, lack of oxygen in the brain, and they were unconscious because of cardiac arrest, and only 18% reported a near-death experience. And also other possible explanations like given medication didn't matter at all. Fear of death, a psychological explanation, didn't matter at all. Foreknowledge, as you know that these experiences are possible, didn't matter at all. Religion, if they are atheist or Christian, Muslim, didn't matter at all. Gender, education didn't matter at all. So to our surprise, we could prove that there is no medical or scientific explanation why people report an NDE cardiac arrest. That was the most important result from our prospective study. And we also did a longitudinal study with taped interviews 2 years and 8 years after the cardiac arrest with all survivors of cardiac arrest with a near-death experience and a matched control group of patients who survived the cardiac arrest without an NDE. A matched control group means the same gender, the same time interval, and the same age. So we found the reason we did this study was to see if the transformation you always hear after a near-death experience was the result of a near-death experience or just a result of a cardiac arrest itself that had never been studied in a prospective design before. And what we found that only patients with a near-death experience had this classical transformation. They had no fear of death anymore. They believed in an afterlife. They have a new insight what is important in life. That is unconditional love, empathy, and compassion, first towards yourself, to your own negative aspects we all have, and also to other people, and to animals, to plants, to planet Earth, etc., because they feel connected with everything and everybody. And they know now the role that everything you do to others will come to you back. So if you give love to others, you receive love. If you give aggression and hate, you will receive aggression and hate. And the third aspect of this transformation is enhanced intuitive sensitivity. That means that they know what other people feel and think, which is quite disturbing for them as well. They don't want it, but they receive this information. So this transformation was the objective proof of the subjective experience, because you cannot prove scientifically a subjective experience like a near-death experience. So that were the findings of our study, which was published in The Lancet in 2001.
One thing we didn't mention in the introduction is that you have also written about your work in the now international bestseller, your book Consciousness Beyond Life, translated in many languages, including Bulgarian now, which is the country where...
Translated to 12 languages now.
12 languages, yes. Congratulations for that. And reading it for this conversation, in preparation for the conversation, I first of all greatly enjoyed it. But also, I learned the importance of the term prospective study, which in the beginning I just didn't know what it meant. But after reading your explanation of it, I gained a new understanding of why your study was so important and such a big step forward. Could you explain what it means that it was prospective and what makes it different to previous
Yeah, the
studies?
previous studies were retrospective. That means that you try to find people who want to share the NDE with you by advertisement, by giving a lecture. But the problem is, so you got to use a selection of patients who want to come to you, because a lot of people with an NDE don't want to talk about it or don't know they had an NDE. So you use selection of patients in a retrospective study, and you don't know exactly after 10 or 20 years what exactly were the medical circumstances. So in prospective study, you start with the question, what kind of patients you will select, and then you can put all the information you need, let's say the age, the gender, the given medication, the duration of cardiac arrest, the duration of unconsciousness, how many times the defibrillation was necessary, etc. So you can have all the information you need to really have a scientific result for your study.
Well, something that is very interesting to me is that reading your book, of course, I am fascinated. And when I share with people what I have read, again, of course, they are fascinated. And just hearing these stories brings a fascination. But at one point, in the beginning of your work on NDEs, you didn't have the experience that you now have. Obviously, you didn't have the knowledge. It was all new to you, and so I'm interested if you can go back to that time when this was all new to you. Could you talk about how you faced this challenge to everything you were taught at university, to everything you knew based on mainstream science? How did your thinking transform in a way that you took this seriously and decided to devote your life's work to near that experience?
Well, I was, as a young doctor, I was a materialist cardiologist. So I had learned in university and on schools, like you did as well, presumably, that consciousness is a product of brain function. So it should be impossible to have conscious experiences when the brain stops, when the heart stops, etc. So for me, it started with scientific curiosity to find an explanation for the cause and content of a near-death experience. That's how it started. And after having spoken with a lot of people with a near-death experience, hundreds of thousands, have received more than 10,000 emails from all over the world, people who share the NDE with me. I was, after years of study and meeting patients with an NDE, I am now convinced that death is not the end. Death is the end of our body, but not the end of our consciousness. So I talk now about the continuity of consciousness. And that's what I learned. And so I always tell people that people with a near-death experience have been my greatest teachers as well.
Mhm.
But should we perhaps first give a definition of near-death experiences, because we didn't talk
Yeah.
about it. So a near-death experience is the reported memory of a period of special state of consciousness with universal elements. And universal elements are being aware of being dead, have an out-of-body experience, so you can perception out and above the lifeless body. You can see what happens during CPR, can happen during surgery, happen during coma. Then they come in a dark space, which sometimes can be frightening, and then see a small point of light where they're attracted to. They define it as a tunnel, and then they come into an heavenly landscape with beautiful colors, beautiful flowers, beautiful music, um, and then they can meet a being of light, and they can meet deceased relatives where they can communicate with. And with the being of light, they have the feeling of unconditional love and acceptance. And they can have at that moment a life review. That means that they relive their whole life from early childhood. And they are connected with the consciousness of others in the past. So when you took some playgirl from your little sister 5 years, now you know how sad she was. So you're connected with the consciousness of others in the past. And sometimes you can have future events as well. So a flash forward. Then come people to a border and they know, when I cross this border, I will never come back. And they hear a voice. It's not your time yet. You have still a task to fulfill. Then have a conscious return into the body, which is awful for them, because The body, like after a traffic accident, everything is broken, is painful, etc. So it's awful. And this kind of experiences happen quite often. So there are more than 20 million people in Europe, and I think Bulgaria will be at least 1 or more million people who have had an NDE. But still, a lot of doctors are aware of this. Most physicians have prejudice and willful ignorance about this kind of experiences as well. So it's hard for people to talk about it. Now, the main cause for the death experience is cardiac arrest, so clinical death. It can be a coma due to a traffic accident of a stroke. It can have loss of blood and complicated childbirth by young women. It can be near drowning by children. It can be in the end stage of life. It is an end-of-life experience. But this kind of experience may happen in when you have fear of death, like in an imminent traffic accident or mountaineering accidents. You can have it in meditation. You can have it in isolation. You can have it in severe depression or just walking in nature. So you don't need to have a non-functioning brain to have this kind of experience. And as I told you before, the essence of this experience is that there is a transformation. No fear of death anymore. There's a new insight of what's important in life and an enhanced intuitive sensitivity.
And this is actually one of the most interesting aspects of the experience of the phenomenon for me, that it can happen in different circumstances. So near death experience is almost a misguiding term. It appears this is a special case of something that occurs in different circumstances where we experienced an,
Yeah.
as you call it, enhanced form of consciousness. If we go back to your work with actually speaking with people who have had these experiences,
Do you know
could
people who had an
you?
NDE?
I don't know if I know any such people. I have an interesting experience that I never connected with NDE before that I would love to share. But before I do so, I wanted to ask you if you could remember any specific conversation with a person who has had an NDE that was especially important to, especially meaningful to you, and that really had a strong impact on
Yeah.
you.
It's hard to make a choice because there's most NDEs accounts are very impressive, and I always become emotional when people share it with me. I resonate with them as well. But one of the most interesting cases also was published in the Lancet was a man of about 44 years old who was found unconscious in a meadow. And bystanders started to resuscitate him by external chest compression, called an ambulance. And after 30 minutes, he came in the cardiac ward. His body was cold, his body was blue, there was no circulation, no heartbeat, no breathing, no brainstem reflexes, so there no corneal reflexes, so widened pupil didn't react to light, no body reflexes. Everything was very bad. So they were very worried if the man would survive. And the first thing a nurse did was to intubate the patient to give him more oxygen. And when to try to intubate, she put something in the throat. But then they found out that this patient had dentures in his mouth. So they took out the dentures and put it somewhere on the crash cart. And it took 1.5 hours before he had no blood pressure and heartbeat, but he was still comatose. He didn't breathe. So he was transferred to the intensive care unit. For 1 week, he was in coma. And then when he regained consciousness, he came back on the cardiac ward. And the moment he was back there, the nurse came in for medication. He saw the nurse and said, "You know where my dentures are." And the nurse was flabbergasted. He said, "Yeah, you were there when I was brought into hospital. And you take my dentures out of my mouth. And you took it on that car with all the bottles that there was a sliding underneath. And there, you put my teeth." And the nurse was flabbergasted. And he could tell the appearances of all the patients, the nurses and doctors who were busy with his CPR. He could describe from a position out and above the body the resuscitation room where he had brought in coma and he left in coma. But he could still describe all the details of that room. So it was very impressive that the patient who had no circulation or breathing could perceive from a position out and above the body, and the nurse could corroborate his veridical perception as well, because he was there and you could tell us everything what the patient tells really happened.
So, how do you feel, and what do you do after you hear a story like this?
Well, I always start with patients asking, do you have memories from a period of unconsciousness? That's the only question I ask. I never, and then they say no, or they say why. And when they say why, that will take another hour to sit there and to listen without any comments. Just listen and let them talk. Because the problem is that usually the content of an NDE is positive. But when you come back and you want to share it with your doctor of nurses, they say, oh, this is total nonsense. This is an hallucination. It's a side effect of drugs. So here you get medication and we'll get over it. And it is for them is the most important and impressive experience they ever had in their life. So they stop talking about it. And they have problem with their family members, friends, and also with the partner. There's a divorce rate of more than 70% because the partner said it's not the same person before. He's now not interested anymore in money or materialist things. He just want to be in nature and to help other people. So the first stage after the NDE is a period of depression, loneliness, and homesickness. But it can take days before they understand that they are not the only one, that this experience has a name. And usually after reading a book or seeing a television program or a podcast, they say, oh, I'm not crazy. And then they can start to accept this experience. But I have met people who have been silent for 50 years. They couldn't talk about it. And
Wow.
then when you have accepted, you can integrate it into your life. That means that you change the way you live. And it can take 20, 30, 40 years. So it's a very life-changing experience. The worldview has totally changed.
Hey there, Simeon here, and this is just a quick break to thank everyone who is supporting my work. These days it's getting harder and harder to make it on YouTube. You have to chase trends, chase sponsors, or edit videos in a dopamine-inducing, algorithm-optimized way, which is none of the things that I try to do. I try to explore the most important, deep, and often difficult questions about life, reality, consciousness, and I try to deliver them in the most meaningful and beautiful way I can manage, which takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, and I don't rely on AI to do it for me. If you enjoy this work and if you'd like to see it continue, you can help me out through Patreon, YouTube memberships, or through PayPal. There are benefits to subscribing to my Patreon and YouTube members program, however, as you gain access to our community events, and also you'll be able to submit questions to people I interview on the podcast. Thank you again for spending your time here with me and with this work. And now back to the video. So you asked me about having any knowledge of such experiences, and while reading your book, I was reminded of an experience that I had, which originally I never connected with NDEs, which happened during a psychedelic ceremony of taking um, a psychedelic compound, including DMT,
Ayahuasca. You
which
took ayahuasca.
yes, well, it was changa, essentially a smokable form of ayahuasca, yes. And I had, as you said, the most powerful, impressive experience on it. And a part of it was especially significant for me, but since it is so odd, I've just never made any rational sense of it. And I would like to share it
Yeah.
with you just to hear your thoughts on it. So this was a couple of years before my grandfather passed away, with whom I was very close. And so I was very fearful of him dying. I anticipated that it was going to happen soon, and I was very anxious about it. I was not particularly thinking specifically about it during this experience, but for some reason, um, after the effects of the psychedelic drug began to take hold on me, there was a confusion of colors. Very interestingly, there was a tunnel similar to what is in this book, but different. There were figures made out of color that were taking me in into the tunnel, sucking me in and in and in and in until I arrived, and this is the important part of the experience for me, I arrived at a landscape like in the African savannah, and the sun was setting down. It was red, the horizon was red. And for some reason, I was certain that this was the experience of death and that this is what my grandfather was going to experience. And immediately I became extremely afraid because I thought, oh, wow, in life I can avoid unpleasant things, but now this is something I cannot avoid. This is actually happening, and it is happening to me, and there is nobody else who is going to go through this with me. I have to experience it. And as I was feeling this, a figure appeared of a black woman silhouetted by the setting sun, and she reached out her hand towards me and welcomed me. She said, I know that you're afraid. Everybody is afraid, but you don't have to be afraid. It's all going to be all right. And and then that was the end of the experience. So obviously, this experience has now no objectively confirmable aspects. I still have not made any sense of it. Obviously, it could be a hallucination. It could be something similar to a dream, even though it didn't feel like it. It felt extremely real and powerful. So I cannot make any conclusions about it. But the moment I
Did
read,
you have a positive transformation afterwards? Did you lose the fear of death?
very, very positive. Uh, I wouldn't say that I've lost the fear of death, but uh, it was an extremely powerful experience, which created the sense in me, the lingering sense, that this experience of reality, which I'm now having, speaking with you and living my life and so on, is just a small pocket of the true reality beyond this ego, this body and this mind, and that this bigger reality is waiting for me after the breakup of this body and mind. So this was the it felt very obvious that this is the case, that reality is much bigger and much more complex than what appears in daily life.
Did you feel home there?
um Well, I've had a number of psychedelic experiences, and many of them have the sense of coming back home. So this is another interesting thing for me. Even though this is a very odd state of consciousness compared to our ordinary state, very often for me it comes with the sense of, oh, I've been here before. This feels like returning. Hey there, quick heads up. Due to a technical issue, Dr. van Lommel's audio is distorted for the next 4 minutes of the podcast. I've cleaned it up as much as I could, but feel free to skip ahead if it's too distracting. You won't miss anything essential to the rest of the conversation. My apologies for the disruption, and thank you for watching.
Well, this kind of experience are usually not the same as the near-death experience. Let's say most elements, as we know from the near-death experience, are not in an experience by using psychedelics. But there can be some elements you can compare with being aware of being dead, the out-of-body experience, meeting deceased relatives, being on board, live review or variety review, all those things usually not happen but it is a kind of an enhanced consciousness, different than your normal waking consciousness. Besides, use of psychedelics can be dangerous as well, so depending on the circumstances, the doses. A lot of people get hallucinations or fright. It can be dangerous as well. But when you have this kind of enhanced consciousness, another dimension, with meeting someone who said you should not be afraid, then you're close to a death experience. But it's talking shit. So the essence of death experience is that the past and the future is available at the same moment. So there's no time, no space. Everything is connected. No local conscious speed, no time, no space, and everything is connected. And this kind of experience really enhance some non-local consciousness hardly ever happens during psychedelic So it may be possible, but it can be dangerous as well.
Yes, yes, of course. And so this is another thing you touch upon in your book, Consciousness Beyond Life, that even though they're different, there are some overlapping elements of NDEs, dreams, psychedelic experiences, and even experiences of deep meditation. So to you, does that speak of some sort of spectrum, let's say, of different forms of enhanced consciousness in which we can enter, in which we can experience life depending on certain conditions? So this could be, coming near to death, or a certain substance, or perhaps the natural processes that occur in the brain while we're asleep, while we're dreaming. Would you say that these similarities between these different experiences point to a landscape of different states in which consciousness can enter, at different depths depending on circumstances?
There may be personal aspects as well, the state of your mind before you get the experience. And there are different levels of local consciousness as well. The higher forms is what you have in near-death experience. Everything happens at the same moment. The past future is available. You could talk for weeks, while the characteristic was only 2 or 3 minutes.
Lowering the activity of the brain appears to, in some cases, in the case of psychedelic experiences, to actually produce richer experiences of consciousness rather than, simpler and duller experiences as we would expect. And in NDEs, the total cessation of the brain activity that we can measure, which we would expect leads to complete cessation of consciousness, leads to this greatly expanded, enhanced consciousness, as you call it. So how do you explain, what mechanism could possibly explain this, that the brain becomes less active but consciousness becomes greatly enhanced?
But first of all, how do we know that the brain function stops at the cardiac arrest? So we have the studies done in induced cardiac arrest for instance, classical testing of internal defibrillation, but also induced cardiac arrest in animals. And what you see that the moment the cardiac arrest occurs, there's a loss of consciousness. The blood flow to the brain stops within 1 second. You can measure it on the carotid artery. The body effects are gone. Body reacts not anymore, and it's a function of cortex of the brain. So the total brain function has stopped. And then you have the paradoxical occurrence of enhanced consciousness. So I see the brain as a facilitator, not as a producer of consciousness. Consciousness is always there without beginning, without end. It's always there around. And we just receive a small part of this, small part of consciousness.
Okay, so to sum up, the brain acts as a receiver and facilitator of consciousness. So this opens up many interesting questions. So, for example, purely from an evolutionary point of view, how do you see the evolution of a more and more complex brain? And how have you thought about why there would be an evolutionary impulse to have this more and more complex receiver, and why this physical world of matter would evolve in order to receive more and more, I suppose, complex forms of consciousness?
That's an interesting question. I don't think I have a real answer, but for me, consciousness is fundamental in the universe, together with information and energy. So it always started with consciousness. And consciousness has everything in it, always, because it's non-local. The human consciousness is more evolved than animals' consciousness or consciousness in plants of planet Earth. It's all a kind of subjectivity. So everything comes from consciousness. Your body is formed by consciousness. Your brain is formed by consciousness. And it is why it has an evolution. I don't know. I don't. It's a kind of question I cannot answer. But it all started with consciousness together with energy and information, and that evolves during time. It's also the whole universe is evolving as well. So, but I cannot give the answer of why. I don't know.
Of course, of course. There are mysteries
Yeah.
about this that who knows if we will ever answer them. Um, okay, so you mentioned that consciousness, the way you understand it, forms this, let's say,
Yeah.
material or
Yeah.
objective universe that we inhabit. So, what do you mean by this? How do you understand this creation of reality by
Yeah.
consciousness?
So when what we see around us, what we think is an objective world, is a subjective reality. So it's depending of your own state of consciousness. So when you're in love, the world is beautiful. When you're depressed, the world is awful. It's the same world. So you produces your reality around you. And we know from quantum physics that consciousness is essential as well. So we know now from quantum physics there is no objectivity in science. Everything is subjective, but because this consciousness of the experiment of the scientist defines how the results will be from the experiment. He designs an experiment, and then you can prove that light behaves as waves, and you can prove that light behaves as particles, and both is true, but it cannot be both true. So consciousness is the essence of what we see, what our reality is, how we perceive it. So it's a subjective experience. The world is subjective. And people who have a near-death experience tell me, when I'm back in my body, this world is an illusion. And where I was more real than real.
This is something that I come across very often. Initially, I was reading I was listening and reading people describe psychedelic experiences as more real than real. At some point, I had that experience for myself, and I finally understood that sense of something being
Hmm?
more real than the usual reality. And interestingly, my grandfather, uh, shortly before dying, he started having these experiences, which myself, my family, and everyone around considered hallucinations. And probably they were,
They were
who
not.
knows? But maybe they
No.
weren't. Because one thing that he kept repeating was seeing around him flowers that were more real than real. And that stuck in my mind because he never read anything about psychedelics or about NDEs or anything, but those were his exact words. He said, "You can't believe how beautiful these flowers are. They're more real than
So what,
real."
this kind of experience are called end-of-life experiences. And we know from recent studies that about 80% who are in the end stage of life have this kind of experience. They're in and out their body, and they can see deceased relatives who are coming to get them. The deceased partner, deceased parents, deceased child. They can see the lights, they can see beautiful landscapes and flowers. They can hear beautiful music, and they don't know that the transition is close by. And they're not hallucinations, they're not side effect of drugs. It's periods of enhanced consciousness. And it is sometimes hard to put it into the words. That's the reason it's mostly not well understood, and people think they are hallucinations, but they are not. It is their end-of-life experience. They happen quite often.
Okay, so this is an area of your work which I think is very difficult to navigate looking from the outside because you are studying something that is uncharted and it is mysterious to our current scientific knowledge. And so you're encountering phenomena which you have to figure out with your colleagues, and you have to come up with some theory of why this is possible. Yeah, you cannot rely on previous scientific knowledge. So this means that you have to be very, very open to these experiences and be as objective as possible.
So
Um,
the
at the,
definition of science is answering questions with an open mind, and forget what you've learned, forget the dogmas. So the problem with materials science is that only that is true what you can objectify, what you can measure, what you can duplicate, or what you can falsify. Now, consciousness, what we feel and what we think, you cannot objectify, you cannot measure, you cannot duplicate, you cannot falsify. This consciousness is beyond our current material science. So a lot of scientists said consciousness is just an illusion, it doesn't exist at all. But I think we need a paradigm shift. That means that we expand current science into a post-materialist science, post-material science includes subjective experiences. So it's a different kind of science as we mostly know now. And then you can include subjective experiences. And you have what I told you, that's experience of psychedelics. You can have end-of-life experience and other experiences as well that you can come to it as well if you want to.
Well, yes, here comes my question. As you take these subjective experiences seriously and you make them the object of science, of scientific study, how do you protect yourself from making the mistake of taking something that actually really is a hallucination or a psychotic episode or something of the sort, or something that really is, a superstitious belief, and then including it along with the actually really valid subjective phenomena that you're trying to study scientifically? How do you distinguish between what to include and what is actually really just a hallucination?
Well, that's quite simple. For a hallucination or illusion, delusion, you need a functioning brain. When the brain function stops in cardiac arrest, it's impossible to have hallucinations. So that's one of the aspect. And hallucination always have a negative aspect, a negative follow-up, and never a positive follow-up with positive transformation at a near-death experience. So what I told you before, you can never prove scientifically a subjective experience, but you can objectively prove the transformation, what we did. So the objective transformation is the proof for the subjective experience. And you can also ask, how can a psychologist or psychiatrist do his work? Because he's just talking first-person experiences, subjective experiences. And it is, you have to accept what people tell you. And when you talk to people with an NDE, you have the inner feeling and emotion. And the problem of ineffability, they cannot put it into words that you know it's so true what they try to tell us. It's not trying to be interesting and not trying to be some very special person. No, they're reluctant to share it, and you feel the reluctance, you feel the emotions behind it. So totally different, but you have to be open. You have to listen without prejudice and without any comments. And that's not always possible for a lot of physicians and scientists as well.
This reminds me of something a member of our community told me on our. We had a meeting discussing your book and your work, and one of the questions a participant came up with was, what would happen to the world if we suddenly all knew that near-death experience is a fact and that these experiences do actually correspond to a reality that exists beyond what we see every day. What would the world look like if this was just mainstream common sense accepted? So, based on the changes that you've seen in people who have had this experience, how do you imagine our culture would change if we took this seriously as a fact?
We
of
would have a
life?
much better world. And I always say you have to change consciousness to change the world. And people who are NDE have changed their consciousness. They know that everything is connected. Everything what you do to others will come back to you. So the way you treat others, the way you treat planet Earth, the way you treat animals, it all come back to you. So people with NDE, for them it's important not the material world, not having a big car, a lot of money, have a beautiful body or beautiful clothes. It doesn't matter at all anymore. It's quite about love, helping others, be careful with nature. Most of them are vegetarian now. They love nature, they love silence. So the way they live is something else. I know someone who was very high in finances, and now he's just for free helping people who have problems with their finances. So he doesn't make money anymore, but he helps help people with the knowledge he had before. So the world changed a lot. And the more people are able to share the NDE with others, but also people who share the after-death communication, so that you have been in contact with conscious of deceased relatives, which is 125 million people in Europe. And I know from Holland, 2 million people have an after-death communication in the first days, weeks of months after the death of a close family member. And usually it's in the night, and they say, then I had a dream. But you have communication, you can see them, you can feel them, you can have contact with them. And it is a kind of proof that where you have contact with the consciousness of deceased relatives, it means that consciousness is still there. It's always there. If we have then share this kind of experience with the inside belongs to it, then the world will change to a much better place.
One really important aspect of your work that I've seen personally is, beyond the scientific significance of it and the philosophical significance and so on, there is also the significance of that it allows people to actually take their own experiences seriously and share them perhaps for the first time. Um, your book actually reminded me of another experience that I had when my grandmother passed that I wanted to share with you. It is not a near death experience, but for a long time, since it is so strange, I've didn't know whether to take it seriously or not. But so my grandmother was we were extremely close, and when she passed away, I was a child, so I can't remember exactly how much time has passed, but it feels like on the day after her funeral, in the middle of the night, I was woken up by a loud noise, and it turned out that my TV was on. Had switched on, and there was a movie scene that I I don't feel like sharing because it's a very personal thing that connects with my life, but it was extremely meaningful to me, and I felt in that moment like this was directly shown to me by my deceased grandmother. I was a child, and so I later on told myself, in years to come that, oh, that's just a foolish, childish thing. This was probably, who knows, probably I dreamt it, and so on. And then more than 10 years later, after reading your book, I finally decided to check, let me see if there is actually a movie that exists with such a scene in it. And your book made me take this seriously, and I used AI. I described the scene and I asked it, is there such a movie? And it found the
Really?
exact movie, yes, the exact movie with the exact scene. And so, if a materialist, a hardcore materialist would say, it's just a coincidence. The TV turned on, it just happened to be when your grandmother died. Which, okay, it's possible that it is a coincidence, but at the same time, it has never happened to me before or since that the TV just randomly turns on with a very meaningful scene um, that feels like a message. And so I don't know. I haven't come up with a conclusion. I have no idea what this really means. But it is just very curious that I had this experience, and reading your book, I now understand that this is quite common for people, even though we don't talk
We
about
call
it.
it a coincidence, a post-mortem coincidence, and it happens quite often. Let's say the clock stops clicking, there's the picture of the photograph of the people who died fall down, this kind of things. A radio turns on, or television turns on, and it is always caused by the consciousness of deceased close family member. So it's not by accident at all. It has a purpose. And this we're called post-mortem coincidence, and they happen quite often as well. And they always have a meaning, and you can learn from it as well. So it's not by accident that it happened. So the message was clear for you.
Yes, the message was very powerful and clear. It remains so.
Did you share it with your parents?
And oh no, no. I just no
No.
nobody,
Okay.
nobody.
Thank you for sharing
You're
that.
yes, you're the person that made me take it seriously for
Serious.
myself,
Yeah.
and
It happens, so you're
yeah,
not the only one, It happens quite often. But usually people don't talk about it. Like you don't talk about it. But people should talk about it. It will be better known. The book written by Peter Fenwick, The Art of Dying, and he describes all these kind of coincidences as well.
thank you. Um, this takes me to the state of the world we live in. So we're having this discussion, but in most circles and to most people, this is a very strange discussion that we're having, a very strange topic, and something that, the natural reaction, I think, is to take all of this as, not scientific, not serious, not real. So how have you navigated this automatic prejudice that we have based on our education and our scientific paradigm? How have you navigated it personally?
That was no problem for me at all. I think that when people have problems with the death experience, then it's mostly because of prejudice and willful ignorance. They don't know the literature, they don't know the articles, and they have an opinion about it. So and then then you become a debunker or a denier. Then they have a problem. But I'm very positive about the younger generation, who is far more open than than my generation. I've given lectures to a lot of students, universities, medical students. They invite me. My book is on schools in the Netherlands. I heard it from my grandchildren when they're 16 years old. They get my book to discuss it. And my granddaughter studies psychology. In the second year of her study, she had my book. I had an exam about it. So the younger generation is much more open, and only younger doctors are more well known, and nurses are always better than doctors because nurses take the time to listen. So the younger generation of physicians are aware of the death, and they ask people when they survive a cardiac arrest if they had memories from this period. So it changed. It is changing. I'm very positive about it. But of course, there are many people who are not interested at all and just have prejudice and willful ignorance. So then they have a problem. It's not my problem if they don't want to know about it.
And when your work came out, it was and still is very celebrated and discussed worldwide.
It was incredible.
Even in popular
I had to stop for 2 weeks during my cardiology because I had all those film crews and radio and reporters from all over the world who wanted to talk to me. Yeah, it was incredible.
So it attracted a lot of acclaim, but also obviously a lot of critics as well.
Not too much. There's something on internet, a critical article, but not really. They did come to me. They didn't want to discuss it with me. But there are some critical, skeptical articles by debunkers and deniers, and that's all right for me.
The edition of your book on Amazon, which I read, included a discussion of some of the arguments made by critics.
I don't know. I've never seen it.
No. I mean, in your book.
Oh yeah, then I'm right about it. Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Yes. Replies to certain questions about proposed explanations, which you find unconvincing. But I wanted to ask you, since we're talking about current and future generations, do you find any question, piece of criticism perhaps, or new research direction that you think is especially important for current and future researchers of NDE? Something that remains open that you think is very important to explore next?
But we don't know exactly the correlation between consciousness and the brain. Perhaps it is quantum spin coherence, but we don't know exactly. The fMRI is also quantum spin coherence, so it could be. But the most important thing for me is that all the important studies about NDE have been done, prospective studies have been done. So it should be discussed in medical schools, it should be discussed in universities, and then it will change. So I think it's most important that it's more well known what we know now about the death experience, what we know now about the relationship between consciousness and the brain, that we know now that death is not the end, just the end of our body, but not the end of our consciousness. And then it will change a lot. I think the transformation in the world will come from the general population, not from scientists. They're very reluctant, they're very dogmatic. So we don't have to wait for them. Perhaps another thing is, currently is our study, Dutch study, duplicated in Spanish-speaking languages in Spain and Mexico, and so now 11 hospitals are just duplicating our study to find if they're still the same results. So that's very interesting. It will take another 10 years before they are finished.
This is fascinating that the medical community is taking this so seriously internationally.
I mean,
I
when
found
you
that
know about consciousness, there's a journal of consciousness studies, and 20 years ago it was 80% was about materialist aspects of consciousness, and now about 70% is the non-material approach in consciousness. So it's changing also in science as well. But it's not widely accepted, I know.
something you point to in the book is that perhaps many of the insights that we are now discovering scientifically and that we're about to discover have already been hinted at or delivered in symbolic or mystical language in the world's ancient religions. And I discovered a very interesting detail about your study, where you studied how people have changed after their near death experiences. And you've shown that people become less, um, for example, belong less to any particular
They're less,
church,
less
but become
religious, but more spiritual. A
more
religious,
spiritual. Yes.
the Latin word religion is reconnect. Religion is reconnect. But they don't go to church anymore because they now know. They don't believe anymore. They know, they have been there. So they know. They don't want to hear it in the church how it should be because they know. But they're more spiritual, more search for the meaning of life by inner experiences. So that's the change that happens.
This is interesting. This reminds me of what Carl Jung said. I don't need to believe, I know, when
He
they
had
asked
in
him.
1943 his near-death experience. Very impressive. Yeah. And it's also
Yes,
important that 5,000 years ago in the Tibetan Buddhism, but also in Hinduism, the Vedas and the Upanishads, the Kabbalah, the Gnostic Christianity, indigenous people all over the world have the inner knowing that death is not the end of who we are. It's not new, but has been forgotten in the Western world. As a joke, I sometimes say when you have an NDE in India, you get congratulations. And when you have an NDE in the Western world, they think you're crazy. That's because of our material world we live in here.
Yes, this brings me to the point that I was about to make, which is that from all different religions and churches, there is a decrease in the percentage of people that subscribe to that church. But there is one particular religion, Buddhism, in which there is a 2% increase, actually. And so I was thinking that there are actually some very interesting similarities between what people describe during their near death experiences and some of the beliefs about death and after death in
That's
Buddhism. In fact, the Buddha himself, where just on the night when he uh, achieved nirvana, had the experience of seeing all his past lives and then seeing all the past lives of all creatures and then seeing the law of karma and how the moral quality of your actions determines your future life and future lives in plural. And so I was thinking, do you think that a near death experience may lie at the heart of, Buddhism, but also many world religions?
it's a good question. I'm convinced that this kind of light experiences, near-death experiences is a modern terminology. These light experiences, life-changing experiences, have been always the, the start for world religions. So also for Buddhism, Hinduism, for Christianity, the Kabbalah, for indigenous people. It started with this kind of experience. All the Middle Ages, you also have this kind of experience that they were called mystical experience, usually by high fever or near drowning. But they always have been known in history. Plato has written a classical near-death experience, the soldier error, but he also wrote in his book that death is not the end. Our temporary physical body is just a temporary carrier of the soul, which is eternal. So he knew it. He was a mystic as well. So it has always been known, and we have forgotten this kind of knowledge. I've been in Tibet. I've written a lot of Buddhist books as well. I've given lectures to Buddhist people and Buddhist monks as well. So I'm open to their inner knowledge. It's very intriguing. But there's also nothing, my chapter in my book is nothing new, because everything has been known already in the past for thousands of years.
And personally, how would you say that your work and the stories that you've heard and the people you've spoken to, how has this affected you? Have you found any change in your personal life, in your understanding
I
of
changed
life?
a lot. I was, as I told you, I was a materialist scientist, and I was convinced that death was the end for everything we are. But this insight changed because of the study of near-death experience and meeting hundreds of thousands of people with a near-death experience. So my life changes as well. So I have a beautiful garden. We love to be in a garden. Our house is always silent. There's always silence. At least 1 hour a day we are in nature, walking and biking in nature. We're vegetarian. Uh, we love animals and plants, etc. So it has changed a lot. Our home. We have contact with a farmer who is biological dynamic farmer. It's based on the anthroposophy, which is very, very healthy food. We have that for more than 30 years now here. So, and also for other families come each Saturday to get their healthy food, which this the farmer brings up a bit to our house. So we changed a lot.
It has been a pleasure to speak with you. We have now gone over an
Okay.
hour. So, in concluding this conversation, I wanted to ask for people who perhaps have a personal interest in near death experiences or even a near death experience, how would you direct them to perhaps learn more, educate themselves, and make sense of the
But
experience?
you have my website, consciousnessbeyondlife.com. They can visit. There are a lot of scientific articles, but also a lot of interviews. You can see there's an interview with more than 700,000 views. They can see. Um, and I have an email address as well. But I receive some 50 emails a day. It has been 200 emails a day after my book came out and after the Lancet article. So, uh, but reading a book, my book, or other books as well, like Eben Alexander of Bruce Grayson, is very helpful as well. Um, Looking for podcasts, like your podcast, people can learn from it as well. So there are a lot of possibilities. And perhaps nowadays I have given more than 50 interviews in the last 2 years because I think that the younger generation wants to listen and to see instead of reading books. So both is interesting and both is useful as well. And I know that patients who have a problem with the doctor, give my book to their doctor or give it to their family members and said, read this and then you understand what I had, kind of experience I had. So it may be helpful as well. And like when you
Yes.
read my book, it was helpful for you as well to understand some of your experiences you had in your life. So it's helpful for others as well.
Yes, it helped me take them
Exactly.
seriously.
Yeah.
So for a long time, I mean, you don't forget experiences like these. So I have them in my mind, but they're just so very different from any other kind of experience that I've always left them out there. Not being able to make any sense of them. But reading your book has really made me reconsider their
Yeah, my book has
importance.
a scientific approach. I think that's very helpful for people as well. It's not nonsense. It's not just spiritual. It's just a scientific approach as well.
I will have the links to your website and also to your
Okay.
book in the description of
Also
this
for
video
Bulgarian
so people can.
book now.
Yes, and now for the Bulgarian edition of the book, which will be the 12th
Yeah, yeah,
language
yeah.
in which your book
Chinese,
is
Russian,
translated.
all the
And
modern languages as well. So it's incredible. More than 400,000 copies have been sold now. And then in the Netherlands, it's the 33rd print. 32nd. So this
wow,
yeah.
that's incredible
Yeah.
success. Um, Mentioning these different countries actually reminded me of the final question I would like to ask you, which I think is very interesting, which is that people have these experiences obviously in many different countries and regions and religions, cultures, and so on. So, what are your thoughts about how much the culture where somebody is from has an effect on the experience? So, for example, if the deities I know are Jesus Christ, or for example, uh, Vishnu, or some other deity or religious figure. How much does that inform the experience, and what do you think this tells us about the relationship between our cultures and then these enhanced experiences of enhanced consciousness?
Well, the death experience is an ineffable experience because there are no words for it. So people try to find words from their own religion, from their own culture. So a child will use different words as an adult, and a Christian will use different words as an atheist or Muslim or Buddhist. So depending on your background, you try to find words for it. But the essence, all the elements are about the same. I know there was once a study done in Eastern Germany a long time ago, and the people saw a light. And in Western Germany, they saw a being of light. So the interpretation was different. And that's the same as others. So sometimes in India, you hardly hear about a tunnel, but then they see not Jesus, but they see Buddha or Atman or Brahma or so. So there are different words for the feeling that there's some higher figure of light with sense unconditional love. But there have been studies done about it in all countries in the world, Japan, India, China, whatever. And it's a universal experience with universal elements, but not always finding the same words for it.
Do you think near-death experience could serve to unite the world's religions into a more universal view of life and the reality of beyond death?
I think you should forget the word religion. It will change the people, and they will be more connected with each other. It's more a spiritual approach than a religious approach. But again, religion is reconnect. So religious is a good word as well. But you reconnect with the higher aspects of consciousness. And that's what religion is as well.
Dr. Pim van Lommel, thank you very much for your time. This has been a pleasure. And for me personally, your work is my introduction to near-death studies of near-death experiences. And I am looking forward to what we will discover collectively in this area. And thank you for everything you've done in bringing this to popular attention.